John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Abram as a blessing in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 give us four major events that are predominant. First there's the creation, and then the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. As we come to Genesis chapter 12 through the rest of the book, we're going to see four people who are predominant, and that will be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. In that first section, we're looking at the human race as a whole, even though at times the human race, like at the creation and fall, are only two people, but still it's the whole human race. As we come to this second section of Genesis, it's looking at one family, the family of Abraham. In that first section, there's 2,000 plus years of history. In the second section, we can say at the most maybe 250 years. So our time element slows way down, and yet notice that there's a great deal more chapters given over to this section. So this is really the main section of the book of Genesis. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Remember, we had that genealogy in Genesis chapter 11 that took us all the way down to Terah, and here is the end of that genealogy, and it's really starting a new section. These are the generations. That's the announcement that a new section is starting. The generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram. Now later on we're going to call him Abraham, but for right now his name hasn't been changed yet, so we just know him as Abram. He became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. So that's sort of the overall family tree. Remember, each of those generations goes down to a man with three sons, and so here they are, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Lot's going to play an important part, so he's mentioned here as well. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldees. Now, the traditional location of Ur is in southern Mesopotamia. You see that down by the Euphrates River. It was Sir Leonard Woolley, who lived from 1880 to 1960, a sort of an amateur. They didn't have professional archaeologists yet, and he began excavations at Ur in 1922. Among other things, he found a huge ziggurat temple tower, and also he claimed to have found a number of flood layers. Now, he was saying he had found evidences of Noah's flood. I'm not sure if that's really the case. Most scholars think, if so, it was a fairly small, localized flood. But that didn't stop him from making those sorts of claims. Here's an artist's conception of what the temple tower would have looked like in his day. We talked about the ziggurats throughout Mesopotamia when we were looking at the Tower of Babel, and the ziggurat at Ur has actually been reconstructed. Here's a picture of the standard of Ur, fascinating glimpse into the sort of social life. On one side we see artisans and merchants and people just going about their daily business. If we flip over to the other side of the same standard, it has pictures of warfare where you can see chariots and soldiers. Now, of course, the chariots that you see aren't the later chariots that are going to have spokes and things like that. These are big old cumbersome affairs, and they're going at a huge speed of maybe a mile or two an hour. But still, this was the high technology of that day. And it was found at this place, which means that Ur, as it's going to be called later on, Ur of the Chaldees, but Ur, that southern location for Ur is a place where there was the highest degree of the civilization of that day. Abram and Nahor, we read, took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. She's mentioned because she's going to be very important. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. We're not going to see her again. The daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. And then an important part that's interjected here, and it's going to come later on in the story. It's going to be a very important part of the story. Sarai was barren. She had no child. So we're introduced to them, and we're already told what is the problem, what will be the continuing problem throughout the greater part of the Abram narrative, and that's the fact that Sarai is barren and they have no child between them. Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. So whether they realize it or not, they have a destination in mind. They're headed for Canaan, but you don't go straight across the Canaan. We'll look at a map in just a second. Notice the passage says they went as far as Haran and settled there, and the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So again, from our traditional location in Ur in southern Mesopotamia, we go along the Euphrates River to come to the city of Haran, and that's where Terah dies. Now notice they've not continued on to Canaan yet, and they didn't go in a straight line, because you don't go across the desert. You want to follow the water routes. You want to follow the good and safe places of travel. And there they pause at Haran. And a portion of the family will remain here. Now we come to chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country, and from your relatives, and from your father's house." Now when it says, "Go forth from your country," that's our old friend, the word Aretz, the same term that was used back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, the Aretz, the earth. But here it's translated country, because when you say the earth, we think in terms of a globe. They thought in terms of just that localized place where you were. Your country, your land. Go forth from your country, your land, from your relatives, from your father's house to the Aretz, which I will show you. And so notice that same term is used twice. So it refers to the land where God says, "I'm going to take you to this new land." "And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great." Now, when he talks about making his name great, remember how God had promised, first he'd given promise through Noah, and Noah had named one of his sons Shem. The word Shem means name. It's the same word that we have here. And then there had been those people at the Tower of Babel who had said, "Let us make a Shem, a name for ourselves. We want to stay together," and God had scattered them. But now God's going to make a name for Abram. And so he's going to be a blessing. And notice how blessing is repeated twice here. "I'll bless you, and you shall be a blessing." We go to verse 3, "And I will bless those who bless you." So that's 4 times we've seen that word blessing. "And the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." So this is the blessing promise. And again, that term earth, but this time it's not Aretz. This time it's Adama. So, the ground. All the families means essentially the same thing. But all the families of the Adama will be blessed. Now, Paul quotes this passage in Galatians chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, where he says, "The scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying," here's that passage, "all the nations will be blessed in you." And he concludes, "Because of that, so then, those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham the believer." That is, what God was doing in seed form was promising, "I'm going to do something through you, Abraham, that's going to change the entire world." That those who believe the way Abraham believed, those who believe in the God in whom Abraham believed, are going to be blessed with him. And he's going to bring about that blessing. One of his descendants will be the one who blesses the entire world. So, verse 4, "So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him." We see Lot going as well, and again, that's going to be a major part of the story. Now, Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. So now they're coming into the land. And so we'd gone from Ur to Haran, and now we're coming from Haran into the land of Canaan. Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his nephew, and all their, well, here it is, they've come into the land. And Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. So Abram comes into the land, but the land is already occupied. The land is already fully populated. There's a whole group of people with all sorts of cities, and they're known as the Canaanite, and they're in the land. Now God's going to give the land to Abram, but he's already given it to the Canaanites because the Canaanites are there. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. He hasn't given it to him yet. It's a promise of what would eventually take place. So he, that is Abram, built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. So we saw Noah building an altar. Now we see Abram building an altar to the Lord. And then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai in the east. Now these are designations that aren't going to be really realized until we get to the days of Joshua. So it's probably, looking back at that. And so he's moving further south into that land. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Now, we're going to see a pattern here. When Abram comes to the land, he builds an altar, he calls on the name of the Lord. He's going to leave in a little bit and go down to Egypt. No altars there, but he'll come back in the land and he'll build an altar. He'll call upon the name of the Lord. And that's worship, but it's also promissory. As he's worshiping, he's receiving the promise from God that there he's going to be.